Thank you so much. I'd love to be here. I really do. And looking forward to being there as well. So um, I really appreciate it. Um, this is the third in kind of a series based on this Say What You Mean book by Oren J. Sofer. And it's broken into three sections based on cultivating presence, coming from curiosity and care, and focusing on what matters. And I've taken a little bit of all of those in the last two talks, but primarily focused on needs and how we can use needs as a doorway to compassion in the first talk. In the second talk, it focused on feelings and developing emotional agility. And we ended up using a lot of surfing analogies. And now today we have just a little bit left to talk about in terms of observations and requests. And I realized that we've covered a lot of ground, especially last time. So I want to go through the material about observations and requests and how that relates to our Buddhist practice. But I also want to make sure that we have enough time if people have questions or thoughts about last time, because I know we did a couple of meditations. We talked a lot about working with emotions. I felt like it was a pretty rich conversation. So, and we probably could have kept talking for a lot longer. So let's say the prayer of refuge. And then I just want to open it up right at the beginning for any questions, so let's say the prayer of refuge together first, and then we can go there. So we'll say once in Tibetan, once in English, once in Tibetan. O Sangye Chedam Soki Chodnama Janchu Badu Dagni Kyapsuchi Daki Jinso Ki Pesunam Ki Rola Pinchir Sangye Drupasho. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of accomplishing the six perfections, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. O Sangye Chidam Sukhi Chodama Chanchu Padu Dagni Kyapsuchi Daki Jinso Ki Besunam Ki Drola Pinchi Sangye Drupasho. Anen Sawe Lama Rinpoche Daki Jiwo Pedi Denjula Anen Jimbo Goni Jesunte Usun Togi Ngujup Saduso. Okay. So I do want to make time for any questions or thoughts that may follow on from last time. Just a quick refresher, we talked the first time about how being able to clearly identify needs in ourselves and in others is a doorway to compassion, because there's a universal quality to our needs, and all needs we have arise from a need to be happy and a wish not to suffer, and we all share that fundamental need. And then we have other needs that manifest from there: security, connection, all these other numerous kinds of needs. But we know we've found a need when it's something that we can get behind, even if it's in another person. A need is something that has this universal quality. It's positive. It's not something we don't want. It's what we do want. And so that was the first talk. Last time around, we went into feelings, and in particular, this idea that our emotions need to be included in our practice. There's a middle way approach to emotions that we can apply to avoid going to the extremes of acting out, being reactive with our emotions, or habitually suppressing. And I think everybody is familiar with situations where reacting to strong emotions created problems. And I think maybe a little more subtle is the damage that suppressing emotions can do. In particular, the fact that it still shapes our dialogue and our relationships, even if we push it down there. And it will probably contribute to stories, and negative stories. And on top of that, people can see things in us that we may think they don't, but you can always kind of tell a little bit what's on people's mind. And so if we're pushing down negative emotions, we can't be sure that that's really staying all in there. So there's this middle way approach of being able to cultivate presence with the energy, the felt sense of an emotion, and just placing our attention on that energy without veering off into a story. So that was kind of the main practice last time. We also did a modification of a meditation he has in here, which was kind of a shamatha practice where we were able to move the attention from points in the body, from the top of the head to the bottom of the feet, to the whole body itself, and then out to include the whole room. And then we did another version of that where we put our attention on ourselves and then on someone else, and then even on the sense of connection between two people. And in that way, worked on cultivating some kind of presence in a means to cultivate presence in the moment. So there was a lot more stuff we talked about last time too, but I'll check in right now and see if anyone had any thoughts or experiences since last time that you wanted to talk about, or questions, things that came up.
Lama, I kept trying to think about when you were saying that you and your girlfriend or partner or somebody, yeah, you were away together and you kept going over a different way to say, instead of this makes me angry, and you were rephrasing it. And I just couldn't remember. Do you remember that? What, can you tell me about that again?
Yeah. So it's the idea of like, and this is perfect question, because this actually gets at observations and the idea of making valid observations. Because we could say that, I'm trying to think of a good example. The lines at the post office are so annoying. Or we could say, I'm really annoyed by the lines at the post office. And in that way, we're being, number one, realistic about the fact that from the line at the post office side, it's neither annoying or pleasing. It's just what we would say like an apparent object. And then our idea that it to us feels annoying, or really, to be specific, like the fact that we find it unpleasant is what we would traditionally call like appearances or projections. So just making that effort to notice our language, how we're talking about things. There's programming happening all the time with our language, so being able to kind of notice those points where we're calling an apparent object our own appearances, our own projections, rather than calling it what it is. And I just finished listening to a part of a Khepo Karthar Rinpoche talk that he gave at KTC in like 2011, where he talked specifically about this idea of making a distinction between appearances and apparent objects, and the idea that we have to be careful to not think that everything's just mind. If we end up at this idea that like, well, everything just arises in my mind, that's the path to nihilism, because that leads to thinking like, oh, nothing really matters, and karma doesn't matter, if nothing really matters out there and nothing exists. Like it's the way we get to nihilism. Um, but we do have these reactions to things that appear. We feel good or bad about things. We like them or we don't like them, or we feel ambivalent to them. And then because of those reactions, we act out, we do things, and those actions lead to more things happening. So particularly when we're acting based on attachment or aversion, we're creating suffering. So in a way, we are creating our experience in that sense, but we're not creating the apparent objects per se in our experience. So the distinction he was making is that like projections and appearances mean the same thing. Sometimes we call them projections, sometimes we call them appearances. But then there's also apparent objects, and apparent objects are what are arising interdependently based on our general karma. Like all of us coming together, we have this community karma or like a shared karma that because of those things, there are interdependent appearances that arise. And that we know that this idea is true because one person could encounter something and say, like the example he used was that's a beautiful form. I really like that form, and someone else could say, that's an ugly form. I don't like that form. But they're both seeing the form, So the apparent object is appearing because of our general karma, but the appearance, the projection is coming from our side. But the thing is, we are so wrapped up in our projections. We think that we're really thinking about the parent objects all the time, but it's kind of like if you're looking at a white wall and you're projecting a movie on it, like you're really not noticing the wall, you're noticing the movie, and we kind of just think that's really there all the time, all these projections. We're watching the movie and kind of forgetting what's actually happening there, the process that's happening, not just the fact that there's a wall, but the fact that we're projecting that stuff onto there. So that's a good question. Like that is, was that what you were talking about?
Exactly. Thank you so much. I couldn't remember, and I haven't had time to go back and watch the recording. So thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. Anyone else? So that was a good question because that does relate to this idea of making clear observations. And this was reading and learning about this was what really made me decide to do some Dharma talks on this, because on the one hand, this seems like it's something totally separate from Dharma. Marshall Rosenberg, the guy who created it, I don't think has background in Buddhism, but there is so much overlap in what's being taught. And it makes me think about how Lama Kathy explains the 4 lines: do no harm, practice only virtue, tame your mind. This is the teaching of the Buddha, as meaning that last line, this is the teaching of the Buddha, indicating that whatever accords with do no harm, practice only virtue, tame your mind, accords with the teaching of the Buddha. And if it doesn't accord with those, do no harm, practice only virtue, tame your mind, it doesn't accord with the teachings of the Buddha. So it doesn't mean things are the teaching of the Buddha, but the Buddha found a method that leads to genuine happiness. And he didn't claim to invent it, or even name it Buddhism. So there are certainly ways that one can find happiness that aren't specifically words that the Buddha uttered, which is also how we end up with several turnings of the wheel of Dharma, things like that. Mahayana, Vajrayana, Tantra practices, things like that. So observations. So the title of this chapter in the book is How to Raise an Issue Without Starting a Fight. And I love that because that first sentence, oh, we need to raise an issue, boy, that can be really fraught, it can be such a bottleneck in communication until we learn to really express in a way that creates some sort of mutual understanding right from the start. And So one way of starting to get towards this way of communicating is really developing our ability to listen. Because when we listen critically and carefully and compassionately, our tools of speech will benefit us equally as much. And it doesn't necessarily mean just listening to others. It also means listening to what our mind and body are telling us so that we can clearly express that in our own speech. And that involves some skill, with presence, and with shamatha, being able to place attention and not veer off into old stories and blame and habit. So learning to listen, not just to others, but to ourselves, is really what we mean with, or is really what's driving the idea of needs and feelings, being able to clearly figure out how we're feeling and why, so that we can then express that. And when we start these conversations, there's usually some event that's happened or some reason we want to have this dialogue. And often, rather than sharing a clear observation, we share a subjective judgment. And that's how one sentence can start a big argument. So observations ought to be a shared reference point. So to think about like apparent objects and appearances, like what can we both agree we're seeing here? Having a context of understanding within which we have the best chance to talk productively about our feelings and needs is the starting point here. And he defines observations as a concrete, specific, and neutral statement of an event, distinct from evaluation or interpretation. So it's natural and useful to interpret the things we observe, but the problem is the confusing those interpretations with reality that others can agree on. And that mixing up of our evaluations with our observations creates copious stress for us internally, and also hampers connection with others and effective communication. So mindfulness can help us discern, as I said in the sutras, what is seen and just what is seen, and what is heard and just what is heard. And the inability to do that is the cause of so much of our pain. So one trick that the author of this book, Oren J. Sofer, suggests, if you want to determine if you're making a clear observation, is could it be caught on camera? So an example he uses is like, could a camera see someone behaving coldly? Or another example would be like, would a camera catch somebody ignoring you? Or would the camera catch someone walking past without saying anything? So these are the kind of things like I feel like somebody gave me an example when I was talking about this the other day. I wish I could remember it, that pushed the limits of that rule about the camera. But I think it's definitely worth thinking about. Can it be caught on a camera? So observations should not be likely to promote defensiveness. I mean, people may not be happy to hear our observations, but just an observation shouldn't be a thing that we know is going to cause people to be defensive. We need to be starting from a point of connection. Like that's really a great way to immediately find some common ground, is thinking like, okay, what can we both agree this is, that just happened? And I statements help a lot here. What I see or what I heard. And with these clear observations, we can then begin to share feelings and needs. And that's really the beginning of this format, the nonviolent communication format of observations, feelings, needs, and requests. And this also highlights something we often forget, which is that we're seeing things from our own relative view, So saying I see or I hear, is an acknowledgement that we are, from our relative view, are in the middle of our mandala, and everyone else is in their mandala, and we aren't in the middle of everybody's mandala. We're the periphery, somewhere outside in everybody else's mandala. So recognizing that we make these I statements can help a lot. And there's a really good story in here I wanted to read. I wanted to read this earlier, but I forgot. It's a story about Sylvia Boorstein tells the story. It's not somebody I'm familiar with, but I guess she's a Zen meditation or some kind of Buddhist teacher. So he says she tells this story of calling a Zen meditation center to register for an upcoming retreat. And this was in the days before online registration. So she called, she reached the receptionist, who explained she would need to speak with a man named Steve, who had already left for the day. So she called back the following day, only to find that she had just missed Steve again and was told to try back tomorrow when Steve would be in by 9 a.m. The next day, she dutifully called shortly after 9 a.m., only to be told by the receptionist, "I'm so sorry, Steve is stuck in traffic." So feeling frustrated, Sylvia explained, "Well, I guess this means I'm not supposed to sit this retreat." And the receptionist replied, "No, it means Steve's not here." I love that story. Because it's something I think we all have done or do. We read so much meaning into these things. Can we just at least start with what's actually happening? Like what we can all agree has just occurred. So the questions that one could ask themselves for these first three steps of observations, feelings, and needs are: what happened? How do you feel? And what matters here? So what happened, meaning an observation that's clear and objective. How do you feel? Being an emotion. And to recap a little bit from last time again, emotions are what we feel. They're not thoughts, and they're not accusations of what the other person is doing. That's another common way that we confuse feelings, is we say, like, I feel ignored is another good example. It's like that's not an emotion, that's something we're saying the other person is doing to us. Or we say things like, I feel like you are. And anytime we say like or as, those kind of words, we're turning a thought into a faux emotion. So just getting used to like what the actual emotion we're feeling, that can be a tricky process. And I think it's actually like kind of a painful process, because distraction is one of the main ways we try to avoid suffering. And so I think a lot of times it's tough to really examine, like, what's the emotion I'm feeling here? Because I think in a lot of cases, it's probably things we feel like we shouldn't be feeling. And we talked about that a little bit last time too, like how much programming there is in our families and our jobs and in our Dharma centers, even about what we maybe should and shouldn't be feeling. I don't think the Buddha teaches that we shouldn't feel things, but I think a lot of times we take these perfect images of bodhisattvas and Buddhas and think that there's something really wrong if we feel things like anger or jealousy, when in fact those negative emotions that we talk about, particularly in the Tantra, ignorance, desire, anger, jealousy, and pride, those are the five wisdoms. Like, we're mistaking them as negative emotions. So the mistake is thinking that those emotions are inherently negative. But the problem is when we have this self-centered view, when we're acting with self-cherishing, we experience these wisdoms as negative emotions. So that being the case, we can't just throw those all out. Like, we need these experiences of these negative emotions as the path. Like we need those as the way to be able to recognize the wisdom that's there. So there's no emotion that we shouldn't be able to rest our attention on and try to do a middle way approach with the feeling, being able to stay present without delving into the story behind it. But what he actually taught here was the practice. If you want a really good instruction on this, Pema Chodron's How to Meditate has a whole chapter on this idea of placing the attention on the emotions as an object of shamatha. But he goes further in here and explains that like once we've been able to do that, then the next step is actually to figure out like what's the need underlying what I'm actually feeling. So if our initial thing is thinking like I'm feeling ignored, and we take some time to really come to the actual observation, like, okay, well, I can observe that he hasn't called, I know that's true, and then we start to maybe get to the fact that like we're lonely. This is loneliness, and that's rough, I think, sometimes to recognize feelings like that. But then we can think, okay, I think I'm feeling lonely, and that's probably because I need connection. I have some need for connection, and then this gets to the idea of needs versus strategies. So needs have this universal quality because they're not strategies, which are based on specific people and places and times and events. That's how we know a strategy, because it's specific to a certain person, time, or place, those kinds of things. But if we can think through the situation like I just explained, like if it's a feeling of, or an observation of somebody not calling, we recognize that we're actually feeling lonely. There's a need there for connection. Then we can think of all the strategies that might lead to meeting that need. Then we can get creative. And if this is a dialogue with someone else, then we can work together to see what are the strategies together here that we can take to meet the need, rather than making it kind of a battle of strategies, my strategy or your strategy, these strategies being sort of these little pinpoints of opportunity that may or may not overlap. When in fact, if we're able to get down to the need itself and then be able to work together to see the ways that both people can meet needs, there's all these creative options that can come up that way. So when we maybe land at a potential strategy, then we come to the step of requests. So another thing I want to share briefly, this is a practice that some of you may be familiar with, but David Trelevin taught this in his course on trauma-sensitive mindfulness. And I thought this was pretty profound, so I wanted to share it. He calls it the hand and fist practice. So the idea here is take a hand and make a fist, and then squeeze it tightly. And then with your other hand, try to open that fist up. But that fist's job is to stay closed. So we know a little bit what that feels like. Now, the opposite side here is to keep that fist, but instead place it in your other hand gently. Just let the other hand gently hold that fist. And I think somewhat naturally that fist will start to open. And it's this situation where rather than trying to pry something open, we're creating a space in which it feels safe. And so it kind of, the hand underneath is kind of saying like, it's okay if you don't open. But I'm here for you, there's connection there. And that's the reason I thought of that, was because that's the approach when we get to this requests phase. That's the way we should think about making requests, is within the situation of caring and connection. And the ability to make clear requests is really the last piece of the focusing on what matters aspect of Sofer's model. Presence, coming from curiosity and care, and focusing on what matters. So when we get through observations, feelings, and needs, we come to this stage of requests. And this is a tricky one, I think, for us. This is the one, particularly in terms of Buddhist practice and the idea of self-cherishing and letting go and all of those things. This is really worth contemplating for us, because a lot of times it may seem easier to just carry a burden ourselves, rather than come face to face with the discomfort of asking for help, you know? And it's worth contemplating, like, why is it tough for us to make requests of people? Maybe it's that we don't want them to feel obligated. I know for me, a lot of times it's that, like, I don't want to make them feel like they have to do something or put them out, and we may think that we're like looking out for their time and their energy and their autonomy in taking that kind of approach of not requesting help or requesting some sort of change or action of any kind. Like, if we just carry the burden ourselves and don't ask, then we're actually looking out for them. But we can actually better embody those values of caring about people's time, energy, and autonomy when we make genuine requests of them. And what I mean is, if we don't float these like trial balloons of requests, then we inevitably get stuck in our own strategies and limited to our own self-orientation. And that atmosphere of creativity and meeting needs for both people doesn't get an opportunity to exist. And we don't have the opportunity to work together in harmony to try to figure out ways of meeting all the needs in the situation. So making a genuine request is about finding ways to meet both people's needs, both our own needs and the needs of the other people. And I think it's also a proclamation of our interdependence. It's like a courageous gesture that opens us up to take on some potential of rejection or disappointment, or impact from the other person. We're really kind of opening up and recognizing that we are interdependent. And as we discussed previously with regard to needs and feelings, we have a lot of habitual views about making requests of others, things we've picked up from our childhood and our family and our jobs and our peer groups, and I think even from our Dharma centers. So Sofer says, rather than being a burden, needs can be gifts. When we're able to negotiate the dance of choice and willingness, respecting the limits of one another's time and energy, all needs become invitations to experience the joy of giving and receiving. And I love that. Like, I've thought that for a long time, but hadn't really seen somebody express it so clearly, that sharing our needs and making clear requests can be like offering another person a gift. And we're sharing something personal, and it's like a beautiful opportunity. So there's a contemplation about this in here that I'd like to do briefly. So take some time to settle into your body and allow your attention to gather with the sensation of breathing. Or if you're more comfortable, you can use the sense of weight in the chair or wherever you're sitting. And then when you're ready, reflect on the question of recalling a specific time when you helped someone in your life. Not because you felt obligated, but simply because you wanted to. Contemplate how it felt to lend a hand and how it feels to remember it now. And then think, how would it have felt if you learned later that they needed help but didn't reach out to you? And then next, recall a time when you needed help and someone was there for you, a time when you trusted that they were helping not because they felt obligated, but because they genuinely chose to help. How did it feel to receive their support? And how does it feel now recalling it? And then ask, recognizing how it feels to give and receive freely, what gets in the way of asking for help when you need it? Okay. So he's really saying, like, if we have needs and we're in dialogue, we should ask to have our needs met. We should share that in dialogue, meaning with awareness of the other person's need. He's real specific about ways of making accurate and clear requests. And he makes the point that it's rare to hear people end a statement by asking specifically for what they'd like to hear or see next. Like our language is kind of, there's so much custom built in to like kind of hide the requests, or obscure things. But so that there's so much of that that's actually kind of rare to hear somebody like clearly make a request about what they need. And he uses the example of like, how often have you told a friend something really important to you, and that person just takes the conversation in a whole different direction, because we weren't clear about, why we were sharing and what we needed. So the clearer we are about what we want and why, the more creative we can be about how to make it happen. And he says a request is a question about one's willingness to perform a specific action to meet needs. Requests are strategies and are distinct from demands. So we've talked now about each of these points of the four and how we know they're not what we're talking about. Observations are not clear observations when they're evaluations. Feelings are not feelings when they're thoughts or accusations. Needs are not needs when they're not universal and in the positive. Requests are not requests if they're demands. So, so for one example, the request should be something that we're prepared to hear no. And the way that we respond when we hear no is a good indicator of whether we actually just made a request or a demand. He uses an example here of like a little kid whose parent tells it, don't spill that drink, and the idea that like the fear that can overtake a kid when they're given that kind of a request or well, really that demand, without any specificity, it's not positive, it's negative. Don't do that. And it's like really like a hard line, there's no flexibility to it. So the three things he said that we should have in a request are it should be positive, which has a lot to do with tuning into needs, because needs are in the positive. So our request should be asking for something It should be specific, like concrete behaviors we're looking for, and they should be flexible, meaning they come with being sensitive to all the needs involved, both ours and others, and the willingness to be more creative to find strategies that meet all the needs. He says, so a couple examples, he says, like, one could say, don't talk to me that way. Or one could say, would you be willing to lower your voice, or can we take a break? Not specific. Will you love me more? As a request, when you come home, can you try to remember to look me in the eyes and say hello? It would mean so much to me. So that is an example of specificity. And then flexibility, one might say, we have to talk. Or as an effective request, can we find some time to sit down together and talk about things? Or if not, do you have ideas about how we can sort this out? And this is the kind of stuff that, like, in a sense, this is like, I mean, I'm questioning myself. Like, this sounds like psychology. Like, is this Buddha Dharma? But like, at the same time, we need ways of connecting with people. We need practical ways of understanding our feelings and other people's feelings. And I think requests, in a lot of ways, are our opportunity to assist others with their bodhisattva aspirations and ourselves. I mean, when we give people the opportunity to hear our needs and give people the opportunity to engage in activity that isn't self-centered and that may actually help another person, and we do it without self-centeredness on our own part, so we're open to hearing them say no, like, these are opportunities, valid ways that we can actually connect with other people and give them opportunities for merit too, as well as ourselves, and not hurt ourselves. I mean, that's another part about requests. You know, there's a lot of damage that has happened, I think, to all of us from not making requests that probably should have been shared, and that can lead to relationships being damaged for a long time. And I think that's actually probably potentially more common in Dharma communities than other communities, because we're so focused on kind of selflessness, and also on not being the squeaky wheel in a situation. But all of this stuff that we've been studying about compassionate communication has to do with connection. You know, it has to do with finding common ground, recognizing common needs, that underlying need to be happy, and meeting other people where they're at, and really genuinely opening up to where they're at, because who we think other people are and what we think other people are saying, we assume a lot of that when we could ask. We could give them the opportunity to tell us what they're thinking or what they need. And this gets back to the observations thing. You know, we so often think our projections are what we're actually seeing. But how often do we actually ask people, you know, it seems like this, is that what you're thinking? You know, or do you feel this way? So one bit of advice that Marshall Rosenberg, the founder of Nonviolent Communication, gave about needs is ask others to meet your needs like flowers for your table, not air for your lungs. I like that one. So I could go on in more detail here, but we're getting close to the end of the hour. And I think it's probably best to tie all this together into this idea and just kind of revisit the whole shebang again. So there's this idea of checking in clearly with our observations. And remember that this is a practice that we can do in dialogue with other people, but that's probably the hardest way to do this. Maybe the easiest way to do it and the most beneficial way is in our own personal practice in our life, checking in with things that we see and trying to determine, is this an appearance, my projection, or is this an apparent object? And really watching for things like this line is annoying, or I'm annoyed by this line. That's a way of starting to connect with a more effective way of interacting with our experience. When we have an observation like that, there's probably a reason we're making it, and it's because we're feeling a certain way. And we have this problem of blame. We tend to shift towards blame for any sort of discomfort that we have. So it's important when we notice an observation that we really identify the feeling that's happening. And that means being present and open to what we're feeling and actually maybe trying to identify it. So we talked about even building our vocabulary of emotions so that we have the full palette to choose from and recognize what we're feeling. And also be sure that we're not claiming a thought as an emotion or an accusation as an emotion. And then that feeling is coming from a need. So making sure that we're able to connect with a need that's universal. That means it's something arising from the wish to be happy. And then what do we do with that? How do we communicate that in a way that can improve the situation for both parties and meet common needs? So that's kind of the whole format. So I don't know. What do you all think? Buddhism, psychology, both?
It's nice to see that the mindfulness is permeating just personal and corporate communication.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, a lot of this I can relate to work stuff.
Yeah.
Work communication. Since it's just me and my cat at home. I can't get into arguments with him. But the words you don't want to hear is what was it? We need to talk. I don't like, that's not good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You need to look me in the eye because I would really appreciate that.
That's kind of sweet. That's kind of sweet.
Well,
hear that, I'm going to turn away and run as fast as I can. Sorry.
Well, that's a good point, because there is an element of this that just like the teachings, like this has to become our own. We have to use our own language. We have to figure out a way of not making it weird, because definitely.
So I will confess something. I had an argument today, and I'm trying to apply everything you're saying, and from starting with something we could agree on, anything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the argument was about January 6th, the attack on the Capitol. And I went ballistic because this guy was talking such nonsense that it was Nancy Pelosi's fault and that Donald Trump wasn't the president at the time. And Nancy Pelosi didn't call the police to help. And, the facts were that if he'd watched the January 6th hearings, he would have seen Nancy Pelosi frantically trying to reach the Capitol Police, the mayor of Washington, D.C., the head of national security, the generals. She talked with Vice President Pence. She was on the phone desperately seeking help. And to think, I just couldn't, there was no ground that we could find that was common. And I spoke some pretty harsh words. So, I don't even know if I'm sorry about that. It didn't follow, I was a Rotarian. I didn't follow the precepts of the Rotarianism. Was it beneficial at all? Did it promote goodwill? Because I was just over the nonsense and the lying. Because I feel we need to stand up against these lies that are ripping us apart. It's the lies, not people, but the people are telling the lies. So I don't know where in anything you said tonight can I find common ground to be able to talk compassionately with somebody that's so stupid?
I hear you. Yeah, I definitely hear you. I think there's a precondition to all of this, though, which is that we have to be talking about two people who want to figure it out. And I don't know if that's the case with the person you were talking to or not, but I think there has to be.
It wasn't the case in my case.
Yeah. So I mean, and that's I know I think I mentioned it in an earlier talk, but I love how like one of the rules of in Tibetan debate is that like an argument is only considered true if the other party is willing to be convinced of it. And it's not to say that like there's no ultimate truth, but it's like if you're going to have a debate, if you're saying a thing and the other person isn't going to change their mind, then it doesn't even matter at that point what's true or not. So like it sounds to me like that kind of a situation where it was like what were I think maybe you accomplished, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think maybe you accomplished what you wanted in terms of like you didn't let the lies stand and you tried to clear the air, but I guess was there like a request you were trying to make or some sort of change that you thought could actually take hold, or
yeah. Well, the good news here is that this guy and I are friends, and I'm sure that we will laugh about it the next time we see each other. And I'm really convinced in terms of your presentation and my reflection on it all day long was that I'll do my very best not to do that again, because I really went for the goiter. I went on the attack. That wasn't helpful.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think he knows where I stand. I spoke the truth in all the cases from what I had witnessed, that he had not taken the time to learn because he's listening to the wrong news feeds. So, I don't know. I don't like to share even a story like that because it really puts egg all over my face in terms of 50 years of Buddhist practice. It surprised me. So I guess
we can all relate though.
Still got
You're
a
not
lot
the
of
only
work to
one.
do.
But I have something to say. I have something to say. Two things, just off the cuff anyway. But why would you get involved with even having a conversation with somebody that has the complete opposite political views as you do?
Well, I was actually we were all at sitting around a table before we play golf together. So I'm there, and all of a sudden he's making these stupid comments about Nancy Pelosi. It's all her fault, and Trump's not the president, and those are just lies. It's not true. So in the past, I've done exactly what you're suggesting: is ignore it, let it just roll off.
Or have
don't say
compassion,
anything.
or have compassion for someone whose mind could even think like that.
Well, yeah, but and that's a good point. That's what now we're finding common ground. I want that.
Right.
But it just, not only was he indulging in a self-inflicted wound, he was trying to afflict everyone around him with dishonesty and lies. So is it compassionate just week after week after week to hear those things and not say anything?
I would just not even be around that person after a
Well,
while.
you can't, you know, we play golf together. We got to be around each other.
I'd find another golf
And with
course.
big
Give up
sticks
on
too.
that.
That part's scary.
I'd
I'm
be
not
finding
giving up on
another, I'd be
golf, for
finding
God's
another
sakes.
golf course.
I have a brother-in-law like that. I can't get away from him. It's like family gatherings. He's there.
Yeah.
He's exactly like your friend.
Come out to the desert instead.
I know. I'll come with you next time.
Next family gathering. By the way,
I
this
know.
is this is tennis weekend out here.
I know. I
BNP,
heard.
Barnabas, whatever it is, tennis.
But this
You
is,
know,
We got
I'm
all
really
the
glad you
world
brought this up
famous
though.
tennis players. And
I'm really glad you brought this up though, because there, I think what I'm going to take away from this to contemplate from your story and this dialogue about it, will have a lot to do, I think, with when to speak, you know, because I think that this is like everybody here is resonating with all of us. Like we've all been in situations like that.
Mhm.
I think probably a lot of us not too long ago. So it's a common situation we're finding ourselves in now, where there's even apparent objects are kind of, it's hard to find the
common ground.
similarities in the things that we even think we're all seeing that are the same. And so I agree, compassion has to always be where our conceptuality goes. But I think where I'm leaning at this point is just, you know, I think I probably will speak less in these situations.
Yes,
Unless
and
I
that's
really
the
think,
conclusion I came to. Just don't, like Jody said, don't do it. Don't get sucked in. But I'll admit I got sucked in today. So sorry, everybody.
yeah,
You're
You know, back
human.
to square one. I'm back to the beginning now.
You're still good.
But no, and the other thing I will say, all day I've been doing Tom Lin and sending him good wishes. I don't wish him well. So it kind of stirred me to do a lot more practice, because I saw the flaws within myself. You know, it's like to lose it like that. It's like, oh, I mean, Kempo Karthar Rinpoche you'd never, ever. I don't care if somebody was sawing off his arm. He would not react.
Yeah, that's like,
Well,
So,
but you know, what's happened here in this, I see this and I don't react to these people anyway, particularly if it's someone who advertises these beliefs. But you know, it seems like it's a form of, they're attempting to take refuge in something. What does believing this get you? Does it solve an emotional need? Does this simplify your world to the extent that it becomes comprehensible? You know, it's sort of not what they espouse and what they believe. They've clung to this belief, and they promote this belief because they think it gets them something. So there's a need behind all of this. You know, I'm frightened, or I don't understand what's going on. Oh, but here's an explanation I can grasp. So this calms my fear. I'm simplifying quite a bit, of course, but you know,
yeah, no,
I think there's something like that going on. So,
and that's actually
it
a
is
great way to,
compassion.
I'm glad you brought that up, Bruce, too, because I meant to say this earlier, but like being able to think through what other people are saying in this format of observations, feelings, needs, and requests, we can kind of have like this universal translator to be able to try to be able to hear people, like really hear them. And it may not, we may be hearing not exactly what they're saying, but we might be able to at least take what they're saying with more compassion when we try to understand it in those terms, you know, like you were saying, Bruce, I think in a way.
I have a couple things to say. One is, I don't mean to be, well, I just want to be humorous on this, on the first part. And then the second part, I want to address something with Adam. The first part is, don't argue with an idiot. They bring you down to their level and then beat you with experience.
Good point.
Anyway,
That's right.
Adam, you know, I'm someone who's had psychotherapy in the past, and in the household I grew up in, it was not really, you didn't really say how you felt. It was not, you know, it was not safe. And so some of these practices I think are wonderful, but it seems like somebody really needs to apply them to be able to overcome that internal programming that I'm not supposed to talk about my feelings. I'm not supposed to stand up for myself. So I don't know if you have anything to say, but it just seems to me that in nonviolent communication and other things, for someone who comes pre-programmed with the inability to communicate, that it's going to be difficult to use these tools.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, I think I hear you. And my first thought is just being aware of these things is really a fantastic start. I mean, I can say from working with this book for the last 4 months or so, like kind of exclusively working in this book, that I'm just starting to get to where I think I like remember some of this stuff sometimes, you know. So it's definitely not a thing that just happens immediately. And like I mentioned last time, I'm lucky enough that I have a partner that I can kind of practice this stuff with. So if you have someone in particular that's kind of reminding you and you're able to try to do this kind of thing, Columbus KDC is going to do a Sangha-wide book study on this. They're starting next month. Like, kind of everybody's going to read this. And I mean, I don't know how everybody's going to be, but you know, that's the idea, is like everybody will have this community where hopefully everybody's working on this. So so I think really just kind of noticing these things in action helps. But to your point in particular about sharing feelings, he spends a good while, there's a lot of things obviously that I didn't get to cover about this book, but he does spend a good while talking about how there's places to share feelings, there's places to share certain feelings but not others, you know, and getting used to like where and when to share feelings and with who.
Okay. Yeah, that's really important.
There's a lot of nuance there, you know, but the point I think that I brought maybe the last time that I really love was this idea that like the vulnerability of sharing feelings can become like a courageousness. And like I used the analogy last time of like a bodhisattva, you know, like there's this aspect of courage to being able to share how we feel. And so I think like any act of courage, it also has to be based on some wisdom, you know, and some good timing. And so I do think there's a lot that goes into all of that. But that's a really, really good point. And this is a nuanced practice, and you have to develop it over time. And I really think the best way to do it in terms of like a practice is to just think about it a lot, you know, and think about things you've said and try to think of how you could put it in this format, or think of what other people have said and put it in this format. It's most helpful for me in like emails, because then I have some time to think, you know, and I can actually process it and read it a couple times and maybe craft a reply. But in the moment execution of nonviolent communication, I think is probably like, I don't know, like Cirque du Soleil or something. Like I can't do it very well, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for that, though. That's a really valid point. Oh, Wendy, are you mute? You
Yeah,
talking?
I
There we
thought. So you said it also, you have a partner that you could work on this with. So when we have these teachings and I go back and I listen or contemplate, it is really hard because in your day to day, you're coming from a place that's somebody else, it's foreign to somebody else. So some of these questions or approaches might just, it's more difficult, because the average person, I would say, and maybe I'm being harsh, really doesn't come from that standpoint, doesn't think things through. And for me, a lot of it, I'll think of it in retrospect. I'll be like, oh, that I could have had, that was an opportunity to do this one thing. And so
Yes.
it's harder. It's harder out there. Yeah.
I love that you bring that up, because I mean, I think that's the same, to me, that's the same as all Dharma practice, like it's a lot easier to do it when you're in a group of Buddhists, or at a Buddhist retreat or something. It's a lot easier to remember the stuff and live it out and all those kind of things. But the hardest place to do it is out in the world where other people aren't doing it. But I think there's this aspect of it that ultimately it's for us. And I don't mean it in a selfish way. I just mean like, ultimately it's about our transformation rather than transforming others. And as long as we're putting in the effort, and with like specifically with this idea, this method of thinking about observations, feelings, needs, and that kind of stuff, like as long as we're thinking about it when we speak and then thinking about it with what we're receiving, it doesn't even have to be the other person talking that way, but like trying to hear, or even better, asking the questions that get at those things. Like if somebody makes an observation that isn't a clear observation, trying to ask them questions that will help get down to the common thing we can agree on. And if it's feelings and someone says like, I feel ignored, you can say, well, what, like, what do you actually, what's your emotion here, or needs, all of these things, there's questions we can ask that will help, people won't even know what we're doing necessarily, but we're actually better understanding them and getting at what matters in the situation. So I definitely hear you.
Yeah. This is great.
Anyone else?
I just sent Bruce a note. I just really appreciate his comments about where it really helped me to hear him say, just look what your friend, where he's coming from, the refuge he's seeking by taking this stand. That really helped, because it does require compassion as a reaction to that, because it's so sad. So I appreciate everyone's patience tonight.
We appreciate your sharing, for real. I think it's always better when we know we're human, together.
Good point.
All right. Well, shall we dedicate the merit of our time here today for the benefit of all sentient beings?
Yes.
By this merit, may we accomplish the omniscience of Buddhahood and defeat our common enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may we free all beings. May we free all beings. May we free all beings. Thank you,
Thank you, Lama
Monica.
Adam.
This was great tonight, Lama.